In this week's episode, we are joined by Colin, a former deputy sheriff in the United States. He's a best-selling author and a CEO. So we talk about his transition from the police force to civilian life and everything else in between. Here we go.
We're joined by Colin. Colin, look, going back to the very start, right, when you first started your career, did you go to college or did you finish school, or like what was the educational background?
Yeah, I went to college. I went to university in Virginia. So I'm in the United States, and I went to university that's about 3 hours from where I grew up. And I studied government or political science, and then also I had a double major. So I also studied German as well. I actually part German, so I actually grew up in Germany for a few years. So I got both, and yeah, so I was there for 4 years and graduated. Got to play football or soccer as we call it in the university, which was fun. And yeah, and then went on to my career after that.
Yeah, did you get a scholarship or did you just go?
Yeah, it was a partial scholarship. So they covered about half my schooling, which was great. And then the rest was on me, but it still helped. University in the United States are expensive. Every year it's probably
Yeah,
30 grand to go to college here. So that covered a lot. And just having the chance to keep playing the sport that I loved was so much fun too. So no complaints from my end, that's for sure.
Yeah. Do you still play or?
Yeah, so I joke with my wife that I play old man soccer. So it's a above 30-year-old league and it's just old guys. Most of my team are actually above 40, so we all
okay.
are out of shape and slow, but it's still a lot of fun. And I watch a lot of it still too. Big Bayern Munich fan, so I watch them on the television whenever I can. And
Okay.
pretty fortunate. For some reason, they show them a lot. Really, they show Bayern a lot in the United States, so I'm lucky to be able to watch them.
Okay. Yeah. So you're an avid fan. That's good.
But coming out of college then after you kind of done your degree, did you go straight into law enforcement or did you have another job like out before kind of law enforcement, or did you always know that that was what you wanted to do?
Yeah, so when I was in college, my thought was I wanted to join the military. That was the United States military was my thought. And when I got out of law enforcement, out of the university, I was trying to decide between military and law enforcement. So while I was making that decision, I worked as a server or as a wait staff in a restaurant for about a year,
Yeah.
and then ended up meeting my wife or then girlfriend, and didn't want to leave her behind. So I decided to go the law enforcement route instead of the military. And then I joined law enforcement in 2015. And yeah, so I was really trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. The military was what I had thought I wanted to do. Back around that time frame, the United States Navy SEALs were the big topic in the U.S. They took out Bin Laden. There were movies about it, so that was kind of my dream as a kid to join the SEALs. And I had a pretty decent knee injury coming at the end of my last year in college, and it healed just fine. But I was always a little nervous about that, and wasn't sure how that would keep up to the rigors of the training that they go through. And then I met my wife and fell in love with her, and I really didn't want to, the SEALs are pretty much gone 10 months out of the year. And I knew that wasn't
Yeah.
going to be a life that would really work for like to start a family kind of deal. So, and she grew up in Loudoun County and told me about a job opening there for a deputy sheriff's position with their sheriff's office there. And I said, well, might as well apply and see what happens. And the rest is history then.
Yeah, yeah. And like, is there a difference in the US, right? Because I know like you have the feds, like the FBI, and then you have like I know the likes of like the NYPD, and then you have the sheriffs. Like, what's the difference in all three? Obviously, like the FBI is like the federal police, but what's the difference between like the police and sheriff's office? Is it the same thing or?
Yeah, so obviously the United States, so there's 50 different states, and every state does their own thing. The US is very bizarre how they do things, but every state has their own like way of doing things. For the most part, most places have police departments like the NYPD.
Okay.
But there are usually more in the southern states, like Virginia is probably the most northern of the southern states. They have what are called sheriff's offices. And oftentimes those sheriff's offices are only in charge of like the jails, detention centers, and the courthouse security. But there are also some sheriff's offices like the one I worked for, which are called full service sheriff's offices, and they deal with the correctional side, the courthouse side, and also the normal law enforcement function like a police department does. The biggest difference is that a sheriff who's in charge of the sheriff's office is an elected position. So the citizens of the county elect that person versus a police department, the chief is appointed by politicians. So it's always an interesting debate about which one is better, because obviously like the sheriff has to run for re-election every 4 years. So
Yeah.
people think it's very political, which in some sense it is, because he has to obviously rally, he has to join a party, Republican or Democrat usually, and then get votes to win. But once he's in power or in the sheriff's position, Nobody, no politician can tell him what to do. You know, he or she can do what he thinks is best for the county, versus a police chief is appointed by a board of supervisors typically, and that board can tell the chief, do this, do that, do this kind of deal. So then the chief has to play like the political game with the board of supervisors. So it ends up getting, it's always interesting which one people prefer. And again, I lived in Loudoun County where I worked, so I kind of like the idea that every 4 years I got to vote for my boss. So if my boss wasn't doing, if I didn't like the sheriff, I could vote for or against him. So that was pretty interesting. Yeah, so it's interesting how the U.S. does it. So I've only worked for a sheriff's office, never worked for a police department. I love it. I loved it a lot, but I think there's also a lot of benefits to police departments as well. It worked great for me because the sheriff and I were pre-aligned in what we believed. But if a sheriff got elected who I didn't believe in, you know, it could have been a whole different story. All of a sudden, you're working for somebody. It can be a whole lot more complicated for sure. So it's interesting. But yeah, so I work for a sheriff's office.
Yeah, okay, that's definitely interesting. And then like your application process, right? Like what application process did you go through? Like did you have like interviews? Did you have fitness testing? Like what was that whole process like?
Yeah, so it took about 5 months or so to go through the whole background process. So when I first applied, I had to fill out like a 30-page screening questionnaire, they call it. And that questionnaire basically asks you about your entire life, asks you about, you know, driving history, your criminal history, your drug use, if any, anything you've ever done wrong in your life. And you basically have to spill your soul kind of deal and tell them what you did. Then I had to go to a fitness test. The fitness test, I was a really athletic person growing up, so it was easy for me. It was the maximum amount of push-ups you can do in 2 minutes, the maximum amount of sit-ups you can do in 2 minutes, and then a 1.5 mile run, which is, I guess, what, 3 kilometers or so, 2.5 kilometers. And you basically do that and try to do the best you can. If you did well on that test, they would move you on to the interview phase where you would interview with a panel first. So about 3 or 5 officers would interview you about why you want to join law enforcement, and ask you just general questions about law enforcement. Then you were assigned to a background investigator, and he or she, their job was to make sure that you told the truth in your whole packet. And they would put you through a polygraph exam. So I took a polygraph exam, hooked up to a machine and everything, which was wild. It was an interesting experience.
That's definitely an experience. Yeah.
Then I had to do a psychological exam where I sat in a doctor's office half a day and filled out a whole questionnaire there, interviewed with a psychologist, and basically made sure that I was mentally fit to be in law enforcement. Then there was a medical exam, making sure I was medically fit for it. And all along the time, while that's going on, the investigator is talking to my neighbors, talking to my family, talking to my former employers, and making sure that this person is a right fit for law enforcement.
Yeah, and they actually go and interview like your neighbors.
Yeah, so they went knocking on my neighbor's door and asking about like, hey, has law enforcement ever come to this house? Have you ever heard fighting going on there? My wife's a school teacher. They actually went to her school to interview her, and they asked her, has Colin ever like threatened you or assaulted you or anything else like that? Basically trying to find out anything that you could have done in your life that would make you a bad fit for law enforcement. As you probably see in the news, you know, there's a lot of law enforcement officers in the country, in the U.S., and some very good ones and some very bad ones. And the role of the background investigation process is trying to keep the bad ones out whenever possible. But every agency has their own funding and their own, you know, procedures. I was fortunate to work for a really, really good agency, so their background process was very extensive and very thorough. Other agencies who are less well funded and in poorer locations, they might have to, you know, kind of not cut corners, but not be able to be as thorough with their investigations. So sometimes people get hired who probably shouldn't be getting hired, unfortunately.
Okay. And is the person doing the background checks, are they like the sheriff themselves, or are they like an independent body?
Yeah, so our agency, we actually had our own detectives assigned to the background investigation unit, and they did the background investigations on their future colleagues, which is interesting. And the woman who did mine, it's funny, she was great. I love working with her. Her name is Natalie. Fast forward about 6 years later, I became her boss, her supervisor. So, because she was still in that role, and I got promoted to sergeant which is a supervisor role, and I got put in charge of the background investigation unit. So then I was supervising her in that role. So we always kind of joked about how she like knows all my dirty secrets kind of deal, and now I'm her boss. So it was, but she's a great person, and we worked really well together. But yeah, it's a full-time role. My team we had, I think, 10 recruiters and about 7 or 8 background investigators, and all our job was to try to recruit and do the background investigations for everyone hired by the agency. And yeah, my agency we had 600 deputies and about 200 civilian staff members. So about 800 people in that's just one county. And Virginia itself has 60 counties, and there's 50 states that all have that many. So the U.S. has about 18,000 law enforcement agencies between local, state, and federal. So a lot of law enforcement here. Yeah, it's about 1.2 million. Well, about 1.2 million law enforcement officers in the U.S. Approximately.
That's great.
It's wild. It's huge.
Yeah. It's like the population of Ireland.
I know it's very different. You know, when I came to Ireland, I got to go to Ireland last year, which is where we met. You know, and I was asking everybody a bunch of questions about it, and it's just interesting how different it is. You know, like every law enforcement is very, very, very different everywhere, and it's obviously a dangerous job wherever you go. But I think in Ireland you probably only have, thankfully only have a handful of officers get killed every year, if that, maybe less. The U.S. we average well over 200 officer deaths every single year. So it's one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. We have more law enforcement officers die in the line of duty than military personnel die in the military, besides like really intensive war times. But at an average year, more cops are killed than members of the military.
Jeez, that's absolutely crazy. And just to swing right back, okay, you're training then, right? So once you pass the application process and the background checks, which is quite extensive, what was the training process like? Like, how long were you in training for to be a sheriff?
Yeah. So the background was 5 or 6 months, and then I went to the police academy, which was 6 months long. It was 5 days a week from 6 a.m. until like 5 p.m. And it was a mixture of classroom, where we would sit in a classroom and be lectured to by, professors and other like legal scholars and stuff about law, about everything to do with law. Then there was a physical fitness portion as well, where they would make sure that we were all in shape to be in law enforcement. And then we also had what's called defensive tactics. So it's basically learning how to defend yourself if there's a violent altercation with somebody. And then, of course, firearms. Then we do driving. We got to go to a racetrack and drive our cruisers around there, going 100 miles an hour around the racetrack. It's that was the best time. Got pepper spray during the academy, which was miserable. Nice. That was the worst experience. So I've been pepper sprayed once and tased once, so taser. And taser wasn't fun either, but it was about 5 seconds of pain, and then it was done. Didn't hurt anymore. The pepper spray, I felt it in my eyes for about a day or two after it was done. So that day I got pepper sprayed, I came home. My wife always laughs. She came home from school, and I was home already because it was an early dismissal day. I was sitting at home with all the lights off, the blinds down, and I was wearing sunglasses because my eyes were burning so bad. And then I was slowly getting better. So I was like, okay, I'm doing okay. But then I went into the shower and I kind of reactivated everything, and it burnt all the way down. Everything burning all the way down. So it was miserable. It was crazy. So they claim they do that to make sure that you could like fight through it if you had to do it in the street and you got exposed to it. But I think they really do it to show people how much it sucks. So they just never use it, because I never wanted to use pepper spray ever in my life because it was so miserable.
So bad. And it's like a double-edged sword, right? Because if you spray it and the wind can kind of catch you then as well.
Right. Oh yeah. If you spray it, pretty much everyone in the vicinity is going to get a face full of it. But so the academy was 6 months. And then when the academy was done, you go through what's called a field training program. And that's where you're assigned to different officers, and you work basically one-on-one with that officer. And it's 4 steps. And basically every step you start doing more of the work. So step 1, you're basically shadowing another officer and you're doing a little bit of the work. And then step 2, you're doing more. Step 3, you're doing more. And then the final step, the officer you're assigned to, he or she is wearing plain civilian clothes and is just there to watch you. And you're doing the whole job yourself. So you're doing everything yourself. And his or her job is to make sure you're not violating anybody's rights or doing anything terribly wrong. But besides that, they won't do anything. They won't help you at all. They'll stand back and say, you're on your own.
And so when you're in training, right, it's like till 5 p.m. in the evening. Do you get to come home every evening, or do you have to stay in the academy, or how does that work?
So my agency, we're fortunate. We got to go home every day. There are a lot of agencies in the U.S. that make you live on basically on base the entire 6 months, like not even go home on weekends. But luckily mine wasn't the state. So every state has their state police, which is like for the whole state. And they're usually more militaristic, and they're the ones who it's more like a militaristic boot camp kind of deal, where mine was more of an adult learning kind of environment. They do a little bit of the yelling, a little bit of the screaming at the beginning, but a lot more of it's to do with like getting you to become a good cop. And it's not as much about, breaking you down and tearing you down kind of deal.
That's good. That's good. And then your 4-step process then, right? So how long does that take to come through? So you've got like 6 months in the academy and then you're out to do your 4-step program. How long does that take?
That's about 3.5 to 4 months as well. So
Okay.
about 10 months of training. And then you're on your very last day of that fourth step, they hand you the keys to your own cruiser, your own police car, and you get to drive home for the end of that shift. And that was the coolest feeling ever. Like, because I just had gone through, 6 months of the background and then 10 months of academy and training. So it's been like a year and a half long process to finally like be given the keys and get to drive, like, even though it's just a normal car with the little lights on the top, right? But driving home in a cop car all by yourself was like just the most incredible feeling ever. And then the next day you go to actually be a cop and you realize you still don't really know anything. You're still very much new and got to figure this crap out still. It's still very terrifying. Yeah.
And are you on the road then on your own, or do you have a partner, like, or do you have a buddy, or how does that kind of work?
Like, are you just going to work? Do you kind of train someone
Yeah.
else in then as well?
So most agencies, you're on your own. You're driving around by yourself, going to calls for service. So you'll get dispatched to calls. And if whenever possible, they'll send, 2 deputies to a call. That way you're not by yourself. But if it's really busy for a day, you could be going by yourself. So, I went to quite a few calls where it was just me. But yeah, it's interesting for sure. It can be a pretty hairy experience because the U.S. is just, there's a lot of, I was lucky to live in a very safe and relatively safe community. My county is relatively safe, but even where I worked in my 7.5 years, we had probably 10 murders, 10 homicides. And then we had 3 deputies get shot. Luckily, all 3 survived, but 3 of my buddies got shot in those 7 years. So it's still a very, very dangerous job. Firearms, as I'm sure are abundant in the United States. They're everywhere. And then a lot of drugs too. Went to a lot of overdoses, a lot of fatal overdoses, unfortunately. And saw a lot of other things too.
Yeah, I'd say it's quite tough, that side of it. How, like, did they have like things in place for you, like, like counselors or like to talk about it, or is that just very much like the culture, like that's just the way it is? This is what you signed up for, and these are the situations that you just have to deal with.
That's definitely how it started. Law enforcement for a long time was very much it's taboo to even mention, mental health. The idea of that is just something you would never talk about. And unfortunately, we actually had one of our deputies, a buddy of mine, Justin, unfortunately took his life because he was suffering from PTSD and everything he had gone through. And after his death, they started being better about trying to provide services for officers. It's still not like the best. It could be better, but it's making steps. They're trying to find ways to to help people going through a struggle. Because I know I mentioned earlier we lose about 200 officers a year on the street. We lose more every year from suicide than we do from actual death. So we're losing well over 200 officers every single year to suicide. So it's a huge problem here. It's the law enforcement and military are usually quite on par with suicide rates. Unfortunately, it's very, very high in the United States. It's pretty rough.
Yeah, it's pretty shit, all right. And do you know, like going back again, right? So when you're in the police academy getting to use firearms, right? Was that your first time ever using a firearm, or did you have like range practice before then?
Yeah. So for me, it's funny. I had never touched a gun before I went to the police academy. And the instructors said it was a good thing because a lot of guys come to law enforcement with having had some firearm background, but usually it was just like self-taught stuff. So they come with a whole bunch of bad habits that are hard to break. Where I'm brand new, so they said, we'll teach you. So it was a mixture. I would say about half the class had no prior background. Maybe 25% had some background. And then the other 25 were like prior military who had a lot of background, and they were just phenomenal at it. They were just perfect shots all the time. And I wasn't great at first. I mean, I passed easily every single time, but I was never like perfect. But by the end of my career, I was almost always perfect when I was shooting. So it's definitely, I know it's a little different in other countries, but in the United States, every single law enforcement officer carries a firearm. At least a handgun on your side, and a lot of them also are issued shotguns or rifles as well.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's crazy because in Ireland, it's a completely separate course to drive a vehicle with blue lights on, and then it's a separate course then to go do firearms. But yeah, it's still like 6 months training and then like another year probation, which is basically similar to your 4-step program. So yeah, it's completely different.
But
It's very different. Yeah, I think here, if they took firearms away from law enforcement, even fewer people would want to do it. No one would, because here is just, unfortunately, firearms again they're everywhere, and violent crime, especially in the big cities. You talk about like Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago.
yeah,
There's like Chicago has probably more murders every weekend than Baghdad does. It's there's a lot of parts of the country that are very safe and beautiful, and there's some parts that are really much not that case. That's definitely not the case.
Yeah, it's a necessary requirement of the job, I suppose. But anyway, after your own training, right, and you're in the job, you eventually kind of reach the rank of sergeant.
Yeah. Yeah.
was
So I was on patrol for about 3 or so years.
okay.
Got 2 life-saving awards. I saved the life of a 10-month-old and then the life of a middle-aged man, which was pretty amazing. And
Nice.
then I got named Deputy of the Year for the whole state of Virginia, which was pretty amazing because there's like about 12,000 deputies in Virginia, and I got named the Deputy of the Year in 2019. And then I was promoted. I put in for sergeant, and I went through that process, which involved interviewing, scenario-based practices, written tests, and things like that. And I got promoted to sergeant, and I was probably one of the youngest sergeants in our agency because I was probably only 28 at the time.
Oh,
And
that's quite
I was
young.
I was really young. Most of the sergeants are usually like in their late 30s, early 40s. So I got a really young. The
Yeah.
sheriff always liked me, which helped for sure.
You must have voted for him.
What's that?
You must have voted for him.
I voted for him at least once or twice, I think now. Yeah. He was the sheriff the entire time I was there, and he's still sheriff. He's on his 4th term now. So he must be doing something right. But then I got promoted to sergeant, yeah, and I got put in charge. So when they promote you, you don't really have a choice on where you go. They'll tell you you're going this part of the agency or this part of the agency, wherever they want to put you. And I got put in charge of the recruiting and background investigation unit. So my job and my team's job was to recruit people and then also make sure that they were suitable to be employees with the sheriff's office. So the process I went through, I was now in charge of running it.
Yeah.
So, and that's really where I fell in love with recruiting. I had never done any recruiting background in the past, hadn't taken any HR classes or anything like that. It's just kind of was thrust into it and was told, figure it out. There was really no guide or manual to figure it out. It was kind of just like, hey, you're now, one day you're a police officer, the next day you're a recruiter. So my world changed pretty drastically overnight, basically.
Yeah, so you basically went from being on patrol then to like a desk job more or less.
Right. Yeah. I left the uniform behind. I was wearing basically this, shirt and tie or a suit some days as well, and sitting behind a desk. And I had joined law enforcement because I didn't want to sit behind a desk. That was kind of what I wanted. But that position was always viewed in my agency as one of the, the not elite, but one of they put people they really respect in that position. So I was also very honored and humbled to be there as well. And I knew how important it was. And I started there in January of 2020. So everyone knows what happened about a month or two later with COVID. And so I was there for about a month in normal life. And then all of a sudden the whole world shut down, and I'm trying to recruit for law enforcement with no one out and about. There was no recruiting events. And yeah, it was wild.
Yeah, how did you was that just like all online applications then that you were dealing with, or were you still able to kind of go out and about and kind of approach people, or is that how it works in the US? For police and for the law enforcement, can you just go out onto the street in a shopping center or a mall and just kind of stop someone and say, hey, would you be interested in joining the police force?
Yeah, some agencies do that. I don't know how effective that has been for them, but a lot of agencies, a lot of colleges and universities will have career fairs for their students where they'll bring in employers from around the state to come in and present, to have basically their booth set up for them. So that's a lot of what we did. We would go to universities and set up our booth, and people who are interested in law enforcement would come and talk to us. But during COVID, it definitely transitioned from a very on-site, in-person type of recruiting to more digital. So I created my agency's LinkedIn profile. We had never had one before, and we ended up using that extensively. And we use LinkedIn really heavily. And in the span of 3 years, I grew it from being nothing to being the largest one in Virginia, largest law enforcement LinkedIn page in Virginia. And we would always track how our candidates claimed they heard about us. And by the time I left, about 40% of our candidates said they heard about us through LinkedIn. So LinkedIn ended up being a huge, huge help for us. And it's interesting because law enforcement in the US hardly use it at all. So it's interesting that they're not really using that platform, which is so recruiting and hiring focused. They don't even use it.
Yeah, I don't think it's utilized in Ireland either, like for the guards.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, you think they would, 'cause I mean, in the private sector, I use it all the time. That's one of my main ways to find candidates for my placements is use LinkedIn.
Yeah.
And I think law enforcement in the US for sure, in the late 90s and early 2000s, recruiting for law enforcement was easy. They didn't have to recruit. They would put out in the newspaper saying they have one police officer opening, and they would get 200 people would show up to test for it. So they didn't have to do, you know, the proactive recruiting. But now with the way the world is and everything since COVID and the George Floyd incident, law enforcement in the US is struggling to recruit. Like absolutely, like vacancies are skyrocketing everywhere. And I think the agencies are still led by the generation that came up in that time where it was easy to recruit. So a lot of them are having a real struggle learning how to adjust to thinking, well, we just like people should be wanting to come to us. We shouldn't have to do anything. And when I was in there, I was like, no, this is not how the world works anymore. You're trying to recruit, you know, we're not trying to recruit baby boomers or Gen X anymore. We're trying to go millennials and Gen Zers. And they're a totally different generation than the older generation. And if you're going to treat them the way you were treated, there's not a chance they're going to stay. And that's what I see now with the business I run. You know, I thought when I started my business, my assumption was that I would only be working with retiring law enforcement officers, those who had done 20 or 30 years. At least 60% of the candidates I work with are those who are quitting law enforcement or leaving law enforcement early, like I did. They're just after 5 to 10 years, they just had enough and want to leave. And that's we'll get to that too, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's changing. It's not. I think like in Ireland as well, like in the guards and the military, it used to be seen as like a job for life, whereas that's kind of changing now. Even the branding on the army is like, "We'll get you ready for your next job," so it's definitely changing. But when you're in the department and you kind of utilize the LinkedIn page during COVID, like what strategy did you take? Was it just kind of showing like day-to-day life in the office, or was it like videoing different things, or were you like actively reaching out to candidates that you thought might suit, or what kind of approach did you take?
You know, it really evolved and it was different every day. When I first started, it was just, you know, just trying to get the word out there. So I was just doing general posts about the agency, introducing them. But then as it started getting more and more popular, I started doing like the videos, the day in the life kind of deal, and showing like what are the opportunities this agency offers. And that's where a lot of agencies struggle with. They think that they can just show the salary and that's all that recruiting is, you know, just show the big salary and that'll draw people in. And I personally haven't really found that to be the case. You know, money matters, of course, to some extent, but a lot of people want to also know that they can, you know, what they can do in this career. You know, can they go into a detective role or another specialty position? What are the benefits like? What is the long-term growth opportunities? What can you offer me? And that's what I really made the strategy around, was really showing what they have to gain by joining our agency. And some of it was very like just posting and hoping for the best. Other of it was very proactive as well, where I would start actually reaching out to people that were open to work on LinkedIn or other places, saying, "Hey, I see you're open to work. This is your background. Ever thought about being a deputy before?" You know, and then you'll get plenty of people that say, "No, thanks," like get lost kind of deal. But there's a lot of people that end up showing up and just saying, "This is perfect. Like I was just waiting for somebody to do this." And I think that's where that translated well to the private sector, because I think most agencies aren't doing that. Very few agencies are proactive with their recruiting. Almost all of them are reactive. They'll post the job and hope people apply, and that's what they call recruiting, which you and I both know isn't recruiting. You know, if you're just posting a job and hoping someone applies, you might be waiting for a very long time.
Yeah, it's crazy, because even just on applications alone, like for job ads, like I think our stats is like 75% of people that apply for jobs are not actually suitable for the job that they're applying for. So you end up having to be more proactive. But when you were like proactively like reaching out to people that were open for work, were you doing any kind of like background checks on them before you kind of sent the message, or were you just sending the message and then you kind of do that stuff at the end?
Yeah, most of it, since a lot of time to do a real background check, you have to have their authorization or their permission to do it. So I couldn't do a whole lot beforehand, but I would go through their profile, and if they're posting stuff that was obviously very inappropriate or not something that we would want, I wouldn't bother. Other ones I would take the chance on, and I always told them there's no guarantee you'll get the job, but you're welcome to apply, and then we'll find out from there. So there was definitely some like not wasted effort, but effort where I would reach out to somebody and nurture them and bring them in, and then they would fail the background process. So that's kind of the nature of the beast, unfortunately. For us, I think like 60 or 70% didn't. 60 or 70% of people who applied basically wouldn't make it through the background process for whatever reason. Most of it being most of them lying, and then some like drug use or criminal history as well. But lying was honestly the biggest problem. You know, someone would say, have like if the question is, have you ever smoked marijuana? Right. And they would say, nope, never. And we find out that they smoked 10 years ago. The fact that they smoked 10 years ago wasn't the problem. You know, we don't love the fact that they're doing drugs or whatever else, but that wasn't the problem. We could have worked with that. But the fact that they lied to us, that's the problem. And pretty much for us, the seat was an automatic disqualifier. If you lie on any part of the background process, you're going to be disqualified because the incident you're lying about happened 10 years ago, but the lying happened today. And that's what the concern is.
And like, obviously, like weed or marijuana is legal in the in some states in the US. Like, is that frowned upon? Like for every police department, if you partake in like recreational drug use?
It's interesting because it's been such a recent, transition. It only became, legal or decriminalized in the last handful of years. And the state where we lived, when I was in the position, it was still illegal. So then it was a pretty easy process for us to say, for us, it was like, if you had smoked in the past 3 years, it was a disqualifier. Now that it's decriminalized in Virginia and not illegal in other places, it's gotten way more challenging. And most agencies are saying that as long as you basically promise to not do it while you're here and we'll drug test you, it's okay that you've done it in the past, as long as you're honest about it. But then when it comes to other drugs, if you admit to doing, cocaine or heroin or something else, something more substantial, for the most part, most reputable agencies, that will be a disqualifier, unless it's like, decades ago, if you're an older candidate. But if you did cocaine 4 years ago, most likely that would be a disqualifier.
Yeah. And is there random drug testing then once you're in, or like, and how often is that random drug testing? Is it like once a week or once a year?
Yeah, so unless there's really suspicion of you being on drugs, they don't really random drug test you. You have a yearly physical where they make sure that you're still physically healthy, and that's paid for by the agency that you have to go to. And part of that physical is a urine or drug sample, so a drug test. So technically it's every year, but again, it's honestly more to make sure that you're healthy versus like they're not very rare. They wouldn't just call you randomly into an office and say you have to, piss in a cup kind of deal. Again, unless there's really suspicions that you're on drugs at that very exact moment. But there's very rarely just random drug testing anymore.
Yeah, it's crazy. And during your 3-year period in that department, do you know how many people you kind of recruited? And was it just you, or did you have like a team of recruiters underneath?
Yeah, so I was in that position for, like you said, 3 years. And we averaged around 60 or 70 officers hired every year. So probably 180 for that. And then we probably hired another like 10 to 15 civilian staff members a year as well. So we're probably hiring 75 to 80 people per year. So, 240, 250 people. But again, we're doing the recruiting and the background investigations too. So it wasn't like we were only recruiting, like it was like splitting our time on both. Yeah. And but then my full-time staff was 8 of us. So I had a civilian administrative assistant. Then I had six or 7 background investigators. And then we had what we called supplemental recruiters. So these were all like normal officers or deputies. So I had a full-time job in the agency doing whatever that would help out with recruiting on like a supplemental basis. So they would come on a weekends or on their off day and attend a recruiting event. And that was a team of about 25 or so that I technically supervised as well. So it was a pretty big team, and it was interesting because, again, I was there during COVID. I was there during George Floyd, and that was really when law enforcement started really struggling to recruit. But we got our vacancies down. So December of 2020, where most agencies were dying for people, we got our vacancies down to the lowest number we'd ever gotten to. So it was like 2% of our vacancies only, which for us is phenomenal. I think now the agency I work for now is around 12 to 15%. So it's shot up since then. So, but it was interesting. We did a whole bunch of wild stuff. We bought a 50-foot long banner with a recruiting message on it and flew it over the beaches in Virginia Beach and Delaware Beach.
Nice.
so that was cool. We put up banners in the airport, like Dulles Airport, which is the biggest airport around here. And went to all kind of recruiting events. We did some Facebook ads, some LinkedIn ads. Those were okay. LinkedIn was pretty good. It's pretty expensive. But at the same time, LinkedIn, for whatever reason, LinkedIn ads seem to go, like the money seems to go real quick, where I feel like on Facebook, it lasts a little longer sometimes. But at the same time, and our recruiting budget for us wasn't huge. It was $50,000, which is nothing, obviously, but some agencies have, hundreds of thousands of dollars for recruiting budget. So in comparison, ours wasn't huge.
Yeah, but you had that 50,000 for the year. That was your budget for the year, and that's what you had to spend. Was it up to you what you spent it on, or did someone else have to say over like, okay, do the beaches in the summertime, do the airport at Christmas kind of thing, or did it just depend?
Yeah, so it was my team and I were responsible for coming up with the ideas and pitching the ideas to my leadership team. They still had the final yes or no kind of deal. Fortunately, for the most part, they said yes to pretty much everything. It took some convincing. Like I mentioned in my first book that I created a LinkedIn profile for my agency, like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And again, that's free, right? Creating a LinkedIn page is free. It took me like 4 months of convincing to get my leadership team on board to do that. I had to go to meetings. I had to do like proposals. And I was like, it's free. I'm not asking to pay for anything. It's going to take me like 5 minutes to create it and like a couple of hours a week to run it. And again, it was just an older generation. Some of them are 50, 60, 70 years old. And the idea of LinkedIn was just like wild to them.
Yeah, the older generation are like afraid of the social media side of things, and it's just the unknown for them.
Yeah, I think they worry about the wrong message getting out there, and I do understand that. You have to have somebody who's responsible in that role. You can't have someone like putting stuff out there that's gonna make the agency look bad. And yeah, but luckily they came on board and realized the benefit of it. And but again, for whatever reason nowadays they're not using it much anymore now. And it's interesting that the less they've used it, the higher their vacancies have gotten. So it could there's other factors as well, but it's interesting correlation that when we were using it, the vacancies went down. Now they're not using it, vacancies are going up again. But again, there's way more than just that to factor in for sure.
Yeah, maybe they might get back on it now when they listen to the podcast.
I hope so. I might have to send it to them. Yeah, you know, I've told them before, like, hey, it's free. Like, I don't know what you guys are doing. Like, you guys, like, they'll send 2 or 3 or 4 recruiters, you know, on a 6-hour drive to some recruiting event. You know, between gas and hotel rooms and then the salary of the recruiters. You know, you're spending thousands and thousands of dollars for this one event where you might talk to 10 people. You put it on LinkedIn, you can reach, you know, thousands of people for either free or very minimal as far as ads if you wanted to run ads. And I think there's in law enforcement recruiting, there's a benefit to have both, you know, in person as well as virtual as well. You shouldn't just do one or the other, but they've gone heavily on one side versus the other.
Okay. Yeah, it has to be a marriage between both. But you decided to leave then, okay? What decision process did you go through when you decided to leave? Like, and why did you decide to leave? Like,
oh man, it was a tough decision. I struggled with that decision for at least 6 months and closer to a year, honestly, because I really loved being in law enforcement. I really enjoy what I was doing. But it was tough, you know. Law enforcement really did change quite a bit after the George Floyd incident, with, you know, the public scrutiny towards law enforcement. You know, politicians talking about cutting our funding, and just the national narrative around law enforcement was definitely hard to swallow. You know, I would get like hate messages on my cruiser from people after the Floyd incident, and again, that incident happened, you know, 1,000 miles from where I live. It's like, I don't know those officers. You're tying me into something that I'd never had any part of. So that was a factor. The financials was a small factor. I honestly, that alone wasn't it, but it was also a factor for sure. They didn't pay very well. It was getting very expensive to live where I live. My wife's a school teacher, so together we made no money. And then it's just general frustrations about law enforcement. You know, there's so much red tape and government bureaucracy that can get really frustrating. And some of the really good ideas I thought I had were getting shot down by leadership teams. You know, so it was just a little bit of everything where didn't really feel the same passion for what I was doing anymore. And I really believe it's such an important profession that people should be there who are fully invested in it. And I started realizing that wasn't me anymore. And right as I was feeling those emotions, you know, I got reached out to by a recruiter in the tech industry and said, hey, I see what you're doing with the sheriff's office. Any interest in the private sector? And it was like almost like perfect timing, where I was having all these thoughts, and then a proactive recruiter came out and reached out to me, and then ended up drawing me away. And again, the benefits of proactive recruiting, because I may not have applied to them if I hadn't been reached out to first.
Yeah. So it was actually you were actually headhunted out of your job. It wasn't like you had decided to leave, went looking for a job, and then handed in your notice. You actually were proactively recruited. Okay.
Yeah. So I had changed my LinkedIn to open to work, but I kept it to where only recruiters could see it. But I had like put some feelers out there, definitely not to this company though, and they ended up reaching out and seemed very eager to have me on board. And you know, I was excited. So I said, you know what, let's do it. It's an interesting, I was like almost 8 years in, and in the US, when you have to be 20 years in to get your full pension, 25 or 50 years of age. So I was in a weird, like middle stage, kind of where I knew if I was going to leave law enforcement early, it would have to be sooner rather than later. Because once you're like you're 12 or you're 13 or whatever, you're getting so close to that pension that leaving wouldn't make a lot of financial sense. And that's what I'm seeing nowadays with the candidates I'm working with. So many of them are approaching that middle time frame and deciding to leave because they're realizing, I can't do another 10 years of this or whatever. But yeah, so I ended up getting headhunted out of there, which was interesting.
And when you went to kind of tell your boss that you were leaving, did you like have to hand in your notice? Did you have to like buy yourself out of a contract, or was it literally like you went in, told him you got this other job, and he kind of kicked you out the door, and like that at the end of that week?
Yeah, so I basically in the US, all you have to do is give your 2 weeks notice. That's I mean, you can quit and just walk out, but that's considered like bad form kind of deal. So you typically try to give at least 2 weeks notice, which is what I did. I said, hey, I got another opportunity. Thank you for everything. And I left on really good terms. So I'm really close still with the sheriff and senior leadership team. I actually went back a year later. So part of my time in law enforcement, I was in media relations as well. And the person who was in that role ended up leaving suddenly, and they had nobody there. So I ended up going back as a contractor for like 2 months to help out. About a year later, just as to give back kind of deal. So I'm still really close with them. But yeah, I gave 2 weeks notice, and my last day was on a Friday, and I started my new job on a Monday. So it was very little. Looking back, I wish I had taken like a week or two off just to kind of transition, because it was a very sudden shift from being a cop to being not a cop. It was very, very sudden and very intense.
Yeah. So how did you find that transition going from like, law enforcement to the civilian world essentially?
Yeah, it was interesting. So at first it seemed very easy. The first 2 weeks or so, I was like, man, this is like, people talk about how hard it is. Like, this is nothing. Right. Yeah. And then one morning I was getting ready to go to the office. Right. I had slept really bad the night before, so I was real tired. And I was getting dressed for it and get dressed for work. And as I finished putting my clothes on, I went to reach to the hook in my closet where I used to keep the gun belt that I wore when I was a cop. And obviously it wasn't there anymore because I was no longer in law enforcement, but my brain was on autopilot. So I went to reach for it and it wasn't there. And I'd done it for 8 years. So that's that day when I did that, I was like, oh man, I'm not a cop anymore. And that day was like a heavy day where all of a sudden all the emotions came kind of together, where I started realizing that I was no longer in law enforcement. And it was pretty intense because law enforcement is a very identity defining career. It really becomes who you are. Like if someone asked me tell me about yourself, I wouldn't even say like, my name's Colin, I'm married or whatever else. I would be like, I'm a deputy sheriff. And then I would start saying who else I was. Like it really becomes, especially in the US, it's a really big like brotherhood and sisterhood where like you're a cop 24/7, not just the hours you're there. And then to leave that and go to the private sector where that's definitely not the case. Like if someone asked me now what I was doing, I wouldn't be like, I'm a recruiter. That's just, it would come down like fourth or fifth on the list, maybe. So it was challenging at times emotionally, but at the same time, the freedom was great. I used to always have two phones, a personal phone and a work phone, and the work phone had to go with me everywhere I went. I was answering emails in Jamaica. I would take it into the shower and have it on loud blast in case something happened while I was showering. Like, it was just crazy. So not having to do that anymore was very refreshing and quite nice. So I actually, I don't share it a lot with people, but I actually really struggled with like night terrors when I was in law enforcement. So I would wake up in the middle of the night from like having some crazy dream about, getting shot at or something else. And I would wake up running through the house. And it was pretty bad. It would happen like almost every night. My poor wife would wake up like scared shitless, excuse my French, right? But scared out of her mind. And luckily, when I left law enforcement, almost immediately those stress dreams almost have completely gone away and don't have them at all anymore now. So it definitely shows, even though I never in waking hours felt I had any kind of PTSD or any kind of, mental health issues, it still shows that even subconsciously how much that in that profession wears on you. I would see a dead body 5-6 times a week. It was constant. So seeing stuff like that every single day can be rough. I've seen people decapitated. I've seen people hang themselves and everything else, So even if you think you're okay, sometimes you're not, right? So it's been very nice to not have that stress anymore.
Yeah, definitely. You can definitely see why more people kind of move away from it, like at a younger age now. It's probably more healthy as well to kind of leave it behind after 10 years service or whatever it is. But your first tech job then, did you have any experience in tech when you were a technical recruiter, right? You weren't actually a techie.
But
did you have any like technical expertise like when you were going in, or was it like learning from scratch all over again?
Learning from scratch, man. It was nuts. Like, cause they I ended up joining a company that wasn't a great company. That's a whole other story as well. But they had just either laid off or lost their recruiting team. Almost the whole team was gone. So it was basically just me. And again, I was brand new to recruiting. I mean, in the private sector recruiting, brand new to tech, and had to kind of figure things out because the previous team had left nothing behind. There was no real like, this is what we're doing here kind of deal. So it was very much a new thing for me because I was trying to recruit for roles I had never heard of before. Like it was very, very tech heavy roles that were really like high level, and some of them required clearances and things like that. So it was very specific. And I couldn't even like pronounce some of the words I was trying to recruit for. I'm like, what is this? Like, and then so in law enforcement, it was so easy because I loved being a cop and I knew my agency inside and out. I knew the agency, like every single bit of the agency I knew about. So when I was recruiting for it, I could easily hold a conversation. But now if I'm trying to recruit like a network engineer and I have no clue what they do, it's really hard to learn how to like judge somebody if they're a good fit for a role when you have no freaking clue what the qualifications even are, or if this person has any experience with it, because they could be telling you anything and you have no idea. So it was definitely a learning curve. At the beginning, I would like send some people up to, to my bosses or whatever else, and they get shot back down. Like, no, this person's not a good fit. So it was, luckily everyone was very supportive and I figured out I'm a quick learner too, but it was a very interesting experience for sure.
Yeah. Did it take you long to get your first placement?
It didn't take too long. I think it was like second or third weekend actually. So it wasn't too bad. Yeah. And it was interesting for sure. And again, the company I worked for wasn't great. They had cut some corners and they weren't great with their client relationships. So that made things tougher for the recruiting as well, because they just won crappier contracts where we weren't even like the sole company they were working with. We were one of like 10 agencies they were working with. And you know how that is. When you're just one of 10 recruiters chasing after candidates for one role, it's a crapshoot, and that's not fun to work on either. It's not great when you're just rushing to try to beat the next recruiter out.
No, it's not fun. And you progressed pretty quickly, right? So you progressed to director of that agency pretty quickly, right?
Yeah. So it was like within 3 or 4 months, they said, hey, we want to bring people underneath you and we want you to take over the team. And they actually had a team in India as well. They wanted me to supervise from the United States, which that was a whole experience too, trying to like supervise a team in a whole nother part of the world with different time zones, different culture, different language. So that was wild. But then I also had a few recruiters underneath me in the United States as well. But it was a pretty quick process. And, but I ended up only staying with the company for about 9 months. So I wasn't even there that long. But it all worked out for the right reasons though.
Yeah, because you had like, you obviously started your own agency then, right? Recruitment Heroes. And you started that while you had another job, right?
Yeah. So we spoke briefly before we started recording, but so part of the company wasn't great. So part of my job was to do business development as well as recruiting. And I just remember like I was actually in line to vote. I don't think it was a presidential election. I think it was like a midterm election for like a congressperson or whatever. So I was in line to vote and I just started a conversation with a guy in line ahead of me. And he told me he was the chief financial officer for some other tech firm and they were trying to find a replacement for some role that they needed filled. So I told him what I did and he's like, oh, we should do work together. So I ended up bringing his company in as a client, I actually had to write the contract and get it all figured out and got him signed on as a client. I then went out and found the candidate and placed it with this company. And, they ended up paying my agency, I don't know, $30,000, something like that. Right. And my agencies, our payouts were terrible. Our bonuses were terrible. I got like $500, right. And I'm like, wait a second. I literally did everything. It wasn't even like a role that was given to me by like the agency I worked for. It was like one that I had created, I had nurtured and I had placed. I was like, man, if it's this, now I've done it once by myself. Like I could do this. So, it was a mixture of that as well as I'm very active on LinkedIn. So I started getting messages from police officers and veterans who had seen that I had made the transition to the private sector. Yeah. And they started asking me questions about the transitional process. And I thought, how cool would it be if I had some kind of company that would, in addition to doing like recruiting and placements, also helping, these heroes, as I call them, with their career transition. Because in the United States, we do very little to help, especially our law enforcement, with that career transition. It's kind of like, hey, thanks for your service. Good luck. Figure it out on your own. Yeah. And some of these men and women, they got into law enforcement at like 20 years of age and have never had a normal job before. and now they're in their 50s trying to get a normal job, and they have no clue what they're doing. They've never written a CV, they've never interviewed for a job, they haven't used LinkedIn. So I started recruiting heroes, and the goal was for it to be a side business forever, right? The goal was to just be a side business, and it'll be some fun money on the side. I'll help a few people, I'll make a few placements.
Yeah.
And then within like first 3 months, I had gotten so busy that I was like, I told my wife, like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Like, I'm so busy. She said, just hold on a little longer. So I did another 2 months of it. And then I was like, Shelby, which is my wife, like, I need to quit my job. Like, I am so busy. So
Yeah.
and I'm so super blessed to have such a supportive wife. She said, you know what, let's do it. Like, it's a gamble, but let's take the chance. And so I ended up leaving my full-time job and doing this business full-time. And it's been unbelievable. Like, being my own boss has been so rewarding, and trying to grow this has been really cool. Every day feels like, it doesn't feel like work at all anymore.
Yeah. And is it only veterans and like police service or police force officers or whatever that you hire now, or?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So my business really has two parts, right? So one part of it is helping vets and first responders or law enforcement with their career transition, right? So that's one part of it. And that's where I really focus on that clientele, cops and veterans. That's where my specialty lies. And that's where I help them with their CV, with interview training, you name it. So that's one side. That's really, and then the complete other side, which is actually very separate, is the agency side, where I'm actually helping companies with their recruiting efforts. And I try when I can to try to find them veterans or first responders for their roles. But again, if it's a very niche position, let's say they want something very specific, not every cop's going to have, extensive experience as a network engineer or whatever else. So then a lot of those candidates I place in that side of things, some of them are veterans and law enforcement, other of them are just normal civilians as well. But it's really two sides of the business. And I'd say 90% of my revenue comes from the agency side, where I'm making placements, but my heart lies on the other side, where I'm helping the heroes with their CVs and other things. But because I'm doing so well with the agency side of things, I charge the heroes very, very little for, the services that we provide, where most resume writers in the United States are charging like $1,000 for a CV, right? Which is wild, insane, right? 800 to 1,000 is very normal, and I charge about $200, and then I donate $100 of that to a charity called the PTSD Foundation of America. And that charity helps veterans and law enforcement officers who are suffering with PTSD. So basically half of the money I make from the candidate services side, I donate half of that to charity. And then, basically and my policy, I'd much rather charge companies a lot of money and then charge the heroes very little, because companies are making, they're making millions, and cops have, not a ton of money. So,
it's great that you do that.
And so it's really interesting. It's not like a full on. It's like a mixture of a full on agency as well as like a coaching service. It's not really one or the other. It's kind of a mixture of both. But I do keep them pretty separate.
That's good. Do you find that it's difficult for like vets or like first responders to get jobs when they leave service, or do you think it's an easy process? They just don't know how to put a CV together.
It's a little bit of both. People that have like higher level experience, they usually have a decently okay job. Sometimes if you work, just a normal police officer for your entire career, it can be a little bit more challenging. And I will say too, that the last 2 years in the US, at least, the job market has been horrendous. A lot of layoffs, a lot of hiring freezes. And now our federal government is laying off people left, right, and center, it seems like. So now they're all joining the private sector workforce as well, or job market. So just getting really competitive. So it's been really tough to watch a lot of candidates, it's taking, 8, 9, 10 months to find a job even. But a lot of it's also just because they don't know either, like they'll come to me after trying on their own for 3 or 4 months, and they'll show me the CV that they've been using. I'm like, no offense, but that's probably why you're not getting any calls back. But again, they've never learned this before. No one's ever taught them how to write a CV. And it's not important, at least in the US, CVs aren't a thing. It doesn't matter for law enforcement. So coming out, they've never had to really learn how to do that. So now trying to figure it out on their own has been really challenging. It's a pretty quick turnaround. Once they have a stronger CV and a few like LinkedIn skills, interview skills, they can get a job much quicker. And that's what I always try to make it like a quick process for them.
Yeah. It's interesting. I kind of find the same thing. Like, it's quite hard. It can be quite difficult for some guys to get jobs once they leave the defence forces or the guards. Especially some of the younger guys that were just police officers and they maybe had a degree, and 5 years on, that degree is kind of, if it's in tech, it's obsolete now, so it kind of moves quite quick. On your book, okay, so you wrote a book, you wrote 2 books now.
Yeah.
First book is, it's the thin blue line?
Beyond the thin blue.
Beyond the thin blue line. Beyond the thin blue line. What is that book about, and what was the thought process in putting a book together?
Yeah, so obviously my business is very much about helping law enforcement with their transition to the private sector. And what I was finding is that I was having basically the same conversation with, every single officer who called, very much the same kind of information, all very important, but I was kind of saying the same thing over and over again, which I didn't mind doing. But at the same time, I also realized that I'm one person, there's only so many hours in the day. And what if I wrote something down that would actually help people, with that career transition? And I'd never been a huge writer, but I started just taking, some time every day to write my thoughts down, not really sure if it would be a book or like an article or what. And it kind of kept evolving. And it's basically an all-inclusive guide about how to transition from law enforcement to the private sector. There's chapters about even like the general, like how can I decide what job I should go after? What should I even do after law enforcement? Then there's a chapter about how to write a good CV, how to use LinkedIn, how to prepare for interviews, how to negotiate your salary. Pretty much everything you could think of that an officer might need when they transition from law enforcement to the private sector, and done in a pretty short, like it's not a very thick book, right? But I also knew my audience, right? So I knew cops aren't really big readers. So I was like, let's make it something there's no fluff in it. It's literally, this is what you do. And it basically walks you from A to Z, how to get from law enforcement to the private sector. And I self-published it, which was great. Amazon makes self-publishing so easy nowadays. And it hit bestseller last year after it went out, which was wild. Like I got notification I was a best-selling author, which was nuts. And I've sold now. I'm no J.K. Rowling or anything like that, right? But I think I'm approaching 4,000 copies sold now in over 17 different countries. So it's been pretty amazing. And then and just hearing people, like I get messages from people in Ireland or in Australia, saying that they read the book and it really helped them. And these are people I would never have spoken to, right, without it. And it's pretty amazing to hear people in a world away saying it helped them. It's pretty awesome. It's been really rewarding, because it was definitely not for the money. Like book royalties are slim to none, right? So it was more about getting the word out there, and it's been very, very cool, and it drives a lot of business to my business as well, which is nice.
Yeah. And do you have an audiobook for it, or is it just the?
So I don't have an audiobook yet. Everyone keeps asking if I want to do one. I really need to. I don't know why I haven't. I think that would actually help a lot of people, because I think cops could listen to it while they're driving in their car, and people just nowadays are obviously very much into videos or audio podcast kind of deal too. So I honestly really should look into doing that. I think it would be a really good thing. Maybe I'll do that on the year anniversary. That's you got me thinking now. The year anniversary is in July 2nd is the year anniversary of it. So maybe I'll do it then. That'll be a good timing for it.
Yeah.
And you released your second book then yesterday.
Which will
yesterday,
be today,
yeah.
But,
This one's completely different. Not completely different. This one's called The Thinning Blue Line, and basically it's about the law enforcement vacancy crisis in America, and honestly worldwide, and how law enforcement is struggling to recruit, talent and retain talent. And I kind of use my experience both in law enforcement recruiting as well as now in the private sector to try to combine the two, and showing how agencies can use, techniques from the private sector to actually benefit them in the public sector as well. And so improving their recruiting, but I also really talk about retention as well, because that's hurting agencies more than anything. They're still treating their officers the way they treated them 20 years ago, back when they could do that. And this younger generation isn't going to deal with it. The Gen Xers, millennials are saying, screw this, I'm just going to leave. So trying to show people how they can actually, they can retain their talent, and that will ease the burden on the recruiting team as well. If they don't have to recruit as many, it makes it less of a burden. I tell the story that my second year in the recruiting position, we broke a record for the number of people hired that year, right? So we actually hired the most people ever in one year. But that same year, we had a record number of people resign or retire. So our vacancies actually went up. And one of our top officials came to me and basically told me that I was failing at my job because our vacancies went up, right? And I mentioned that as an example of what agencies are doing wrong. Like the retention part isn't a recruiter's problem, right? It's not up to me. All I can do is try to bring as much talent as I can. And we did that, right? We broke a record, most hires ever with the same number of staff. My staff didn't get any bigger, it was the same size as always been. But the agency had failed to retain staff. But the leadership, kind of being blind, said, that recruiting was failing. Again, agencies focus so much on recruiting, they fail to focus on the retention part of it. And that's honest. In my book, I talk about that's more important than recruiting is retention.
Yeah, because I'd actually always say to clients, like, it's my job to recruit them, it's your job to keep them.
Yeah, I love that. Very true.
So, yeah, I'd always say that to clients. But it is what it is. I think, so who is this book for? Like, what's your target audience? Is it actually like heads of law enforcement? Is it for government? Who is it for?
It's a little bit of everything. I think it can be very beneficial to senior leadership, like the chiefs and the sheriffs for sure. But I think it also can be very beneficial to the lower level supervisors as well as just officers in general, because I do think it's a topic that obviously impacts all of them. And agency recruiting as well as retention is really, it shouldn't be just the responsibility of one unit. So in the book I talk about making it an agency-wide effort to recruit. A normal officer could be a recruiter, not necessarily officially, but he or she, when he's out on patrol, if he talks to a young person who's interested in being a police officer, what a great recruiter he or she could be by just talking about what they're doing. So I think it's a book that could really benefit them, but I also think it could be a book that could benefit politicians and policymakers as well, because they're the ones making policies that are having negative impacts on law enforcement. A lot of the defund the police movement that happened after George Floyd, we can argue whether or not the intentions were pure or not, but the fact is, though, that the decisions they've made since then, they claim the effort was to drive away bad police officers, has done the opposite in my view. I think the negative officers will stay in law enforcement because they can't go anywhere else. The good officers are the ones going to be leaving. And then the good candidates who could join law enforcement are saying, no, thank you, I'm not doing this, and are staying away. So while that movement was to try to improve law enforcement, I think it's having the opposite effect, where it's actually causing it's causing it to just the bad apples are going to stay and the good apples are going to leave, unfortunately. So I think it's going to be very useful for politicians as well.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds interesting. It could even be good for company owners, just kind of read it from a different perspective, like of law enforcement.
Right. Yeah. And that's very, very good point. Honestly, even though it has a very law enforcement like focus, a lot of the techniques and just general themes of the book could honestly be a great resource for any company or any organization in any industry. It doesn't have to just be law enforcement, even the private sector, just treating your people well. I don't know how it is in Ireland, but here in the US, job hopping has gotten so normal now with people just like jumping ship constantly. So that's obviously increasing companies' recruiting budgets too. They're having to recruit way more because people are staying for, a year and a half and then leaving. What can you do to try to keep them there? Whether it be paying them more, showing them long-term growth potential, and a variety of other things. It's just, I think a lot of the people are still failing to really show this younger generation how to stay with one organization. But as long as they see they can make more money and have more opportunity somewhere else, they want to keep switching around until they can't anymore.
Yeah, I think there's no loyalty anymore, because we see like the layoffs happening, so and COVID and stuff like that, people are like worried they're going to leave their jobs or lose their jobs even. So we've got more of that stuff happening. But I find in Ireland, like if you've been in a job for like 2 years, like that's like really good, and we're like a good tenure in a job, right?
But like really,
it's actually probably really bad.
You can't really blame the candidates though. For the most part, if you stay with one company, you might get a 2% raise, a 3% raise if you stay.
Yeah.
But people who are like my sister has had, a couple of jobs in the last 5-6 years. And when she switches jobs, she gets about a 20% raise almost every single time, and it's like, why would I stay somewhere if I'm getting a 2% raise, if I can just leave somewhere else and get a 20% raise? That would take me, 5 years, 6 years to get to that if I stayed. And then like you said, the loyalty's gone too. My dad worked 30 years at Xerox, right? And he had a coworker who was there for 20 some years and got laid off. After 20 years, it was just like from one day to the next, like, hey, sorry, we're having layoffs. You're no longer with us. After 2 decades of loyal service, they have no problem just saying, see ya. So these companies expect that their employees should have loyalty towards them, but then they don't show any in return either. It's like the whole week, the 2 weeks notice standard in the US. Like they expect employees to give 2 weeks notice, but if there are layoffs, the layoffs are today. You're fired. You're gone. And it's just like that. The standard isn't the same. They expect loyalty, but don't give it. So that's going to have to change with this younger generation.
Is 2 weeks like the legal amount of time that you have to give for notice? I thought it was like literally a day, or you can go in and be told you want to leave and then be kicked out the door straight away. Can that happen?
You can, yeah. So you don't. It's not legally required to give 2 weeks. It's considered good practice. And if you leave, if if you, let's say you quit and you just walk out one day to the next, they would never hire you again for the most part. You'd basically be looked upon as having left them in a bind. And if the new company asked for a reference, they would probably leave you a bad reference because of that. So it's really expected in the US that you would give 2 weeks notice out of a courtesy to your employer. Now and then companies might, if it's very sensitive information or anything else, they might just cut you off just to get you out of there. But the employee should be giving 2 weeks notice as the standard. But a lot of the layoffs we're seeing in the US, they're not giving them any time. It's literally overnight. You're just laid off. Like, it's just, we might pay you for a little bit longer, but even that's not guaranteed.
Yeah. My partner actually got offered like redundancy or layoff or whatever, but she's been given like 3 to 6 months notice, right?
So that's like,
wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's we see a lot of the companies in the US they're from other countries. The head company, the main part of the companies from Japan or whatever else, they're usually much better with giving better benefits than that. A lot of the American based companies are just like, nope, you're gone, axed. Whatever, adios. The bottom dollar is most important. We're like, a Japanese company might be very more focused on what's the right thing to do versus like, what can we make off of this kind of deal.
Yeah. Just going back, right? So do you know when you're like negotiating someone's salary or like you're headhunting someone to like move from like one company to the other, what's the typical like markup like you'll put on the salary? Like, would you mark it up by like 20%, 10%, or would you ask the person what they wanted and send them through at a much higher rate than their current salary, or like how do you kind of work that out?
It's a little bit of a mixture of both, trying to see what the client companies, what their hiring range is, and then obviously talking to the candidate as well, and then seeing what he or she is looking for. And then obviously I do a lot of research as well to see what's the fair going rate as well. Because, if someone says they're okay with making 80K, let's say, but you do research and say for this role in Washington, D.C. or whatever, they would deserve to get 90,000. I would push to have the higher placement, not just for my own, like to make a higher fee, but just because it's the right thing to do as well. But I'm always, at least for here, luckily companies are getting better now with providing starting salary ranges. For a long time, they were not doing it. And some states are now legally required to share the starting salary range, where they actually say this is the actual range. So I think that's a good thing that people can know, because for a long time it wasn't legally required. So companies could not tell you what the range is. And if you came in, let's say they were planning to pay 100,000, but you say I'm good with 80,000. Okay, 80,000 it is, even though they were wanting to pay 100,000. So now that's changed. It's still not perfect because some states have like a very vague description of what's required. They say you have to have a range, and then they'll put the range. The company will put the range as $1 to $1 million. That's our range, and it's like, well, that's obviously
that's not great.
A crappy range. Yeah, it's not legitimate. But a lot of them are getting way more strict, saying you have to get a legitimate range. Like the starting salary range is between 80K and 100,000. And that way you as a candidate know from the get-go whether or not that range will work for you. That way you're not wasting your own time going through an interview process if it's not going to pay you what you need to make.
And would a company like be like kind of vague on what the range is with the recruiter, like with yourself, or would they be pretty open like what the range is?
So a lot of recruiting agencies, I think, that are desperate for clients will take any kind of client, even if they are vague. I don't play with it. I tell them I need the salary range, or else I'm not going to work on it. And I've lost some clients with that, but I'd rather work with the good ones, because I'm not playing that game. I want to be honest with the candidates, because that's one of the first things when I reach out to candidates or tell them about the role, I tell them the range almost immediately, because I don't want to waste my time, and I definitely don't want to waste their time either. Because sometimes someone will apply for a role thinking it pays way more than it does, and if I do a couple of rounds of interviews and then send them to the client, and they interview them a few times, and then they find out, well, we're $50,000 off in the salary. What a huge waste of time it was for everybody. So I'd rather just be honest. But yeah, there's definitely companies that try to minimize it. Like, it's a fair salary or it's a competitive salary. And to me, when you say it's a competitive salary, that means the salary sucks most likely, because if it's a really good salary, you'll shout it from the rooftops if it's a good salary. The ones who are saying it's competitive are usually the ones that are trying to undercut it.
It's lower,
possible.
And a big thing I find as well, right? So even if, like, let's say someone is on like 70K and the benchmark for the role is maybe 90 to 120, and they lie, right? They say, oh yeah, I want to achieve, let's say 100K. I want 100K if I move to this job. But then they get the job, right? And they're not as good as they said they were in the interview, and they end up getting fired. Does that happen much?
Some, yeah. It's I've been so far, knock on wood, pretty fortunate that most people end up staying doing very well and staying, but it doesn't definitely does happen too. And I always
Yeah.
tell the clients, listen, like, yeah, I'll do my vetting, but it's still on you as well to make sure that they meet your qualifications too. Like I can only do so much, right? It
Yeah.
still has to meet your qualifications too. But I usually try to be very honest with both sides. I don't try to sneak anybody by. If I don't think they're a good fit, I won't recommend them.
Yeah.
But that definitely can happen though for sure because some candidates can interview really well, right? It doesn't mean they're good at their job. Some people are just phenomenal interviewers just
Yeah.
because they do it all the time, but doesn't mean they're going to be a good employee though.
Yeah.
But do you find like clients are like they're receptive to like your advice on like different things, or like would they just kind of do what they wanted even if you recommended someone, or you're kind of like on the fence?
My favorite clients are the ones that are really open to like hearing what I have to say, and that's usually the ones I prefer to work with anyway. There are some clients that don't want anything, they don't want to hear anything. They want to do their own process. They want to get the CV and then do their own thing. And so it's a little bit of both. There are companies that are really open to it. Some of them even have me help them with the job description, even, which is kind of cool. Like they'll even like, hey, like we have a very small HR team. Would love to have your input on like the salary range and the wording of this. And that's always really cool to get their input too. Okay, for them to ask my input, I mean. But then there's plenty of companies too that are like, no, we want to do our own thing. Just send us a CV and we'll take it from here. And it's no hard feelings as long as they're good to the candidate and pay me on time. That's always nice too.
That's the main thing, right?
That's a big thing, right? Yeah, pay me on time.
Paying on time, that's a bit of a tricky one sometimes.
Yeah, I
now.
haven't had too much trouble. There was a couple of ones I had to like not quite threaten legal action, but gotten close. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to like if it's like a $10,000 placement fee or whatever, which is great, right? But at the same time, it's like the headache of going through the legal process for that would be so annoying. So thank God it hasn't had to happen yet.
Yeah, okay. You're lucky so.
And here, some of my clients are, I have clients that are in California. What a pain it will be to like do the legal action with a company that's 2,000 miles away. Like that would be a huge headache. Yeah.
Nightmare. Well, look, what advice then would you give someone that's thinking about leaving law enforcement or the military? What advice would you give them leaving, like if they're thinking about leaving or getting prepared to leave?
Yeah. So one of the big things I always tell people is try to start the process as early as you can. The sooner the better. Get your CV squared away as soon as possible. Get on LinkedIn, start networking with people, and start really doing research on what you want to do next. Because one of the main things I see, especially with law enforcement, they'll wait until like the week before their retirement date to start looking for a job or start thinking about it. And in this current job market, it's tough to find a job. So you have to be very proactive with it. So start early, get a great CV, get a great LinkedIn, and then network your butt off because networking nowadays is so essential. Most candidates find their job through networking nowadays.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then what's something then you wish someone told you before you kind of transitioned to civilian life?
Or is it
for me, I think it would be that it's not as scary and not as intimidating as you think it's going to be. Because I was pretty nervous and uncertain about it and held me back for a few months. I was quicker than some people, but there's a lot of officers who are so intimidated by the process that they just don't do it just because they think it's going to be so terrifying. The private sector can be pretty awesome. If you get the right company and the right organization, you can do very well in the private sector. And a lot of the skills that you have from law enforcement and the military translate very well to the private sector. You just have to learn how to articulate them in the right way and show it to civilian employers that you can be a great fit for them. But yeah, just know that it's not as scary as you think it is. That's something I would like to hear back then.
Yeah, I actually left the military twice.
Oh, did you?
So,
okay, I did once.
So
yeah. So I left and I had like a leave, like annual leave. So I took like some annual leave for like 4 weeks while I was in this like new job, just to kind of. And I had my family at me. They were like, "Why did you leave the army? Like, why did you do it? Like, go back. It's a good pensionable job. It's a job for life." And I was like, "No way, I'm done." But because they put so much doubt in my head, I ended up going back. And then like I think 18 months later, I was back out the door. Like, and I was like, "I'm never going back."
Yeah, I think once that's the thing too. Once you made a decision that you're no longer fully invested in either the military or law enforcement, that's probably a good sign that you should leave. Because I think it's very rare that the feeling of like the love and the drive you had for that role to come back is pretty rare. I think once you usually know that your heart's no longer in it, it's probably a good time to do something else.
Yeah, it's one of those things. But look, any final words before you wrap it up, or are you happy enough?
Yeah, this was awesome. I had a really good time, and everyone listening in Ireland, I came to visit last year for the first time, and it was awesome. I had a great time, and I can't wait to go back again. Yeah, I would love to come visit again, and maybe next year I'll come by. And but otherwise, just just be proactive with your job hunt process and go after what you want to do, because you can do so much in your life after law enforcement, after the military, or no matter what else you're doing right now. Don't feel stuck in whatever you're doing, because I thought I was stuck in my career, and now I've gone from being a cop to being a CEO and being a best-selling author. So life can change in amazing ways very fast. So just go after what you want to do.
Yeah, perfect. All right, thanks very much, Colin. It was a pleasure to
Yeah,
have you on.
absolutely. Thanks for having me.